we'll start just in a couple of moments. How's everyone's essays going?
Great.
Great. Lots of enthusiastic head nodding, so it's good to hear that most of you have finished that task and it's ready to be uploaded shortly. Has anyone uploaded it?
Fred, you have lost touch with reality.
Have I? Maybe I'm just an eternal optimist. I'm hopeful that you will be more organised than I ever was myself.
Fred, don't even go there.
Don't even go there.
I'm all about not knowing stupid stuff. I get hooked by one thing at a time. Whatever comes first, that's getting the presentation is getting and now I'm relaxing after lunch and then I'll start thinking
Alright. Thanks everyone. Let's make a start. So as always, we're small in number physically, but there are 30 odd people out there as distance students in distance mode, and of course others who log on to view this lecture as a video recording as well. We have another special guest today for class. I hope you enjoyed Selena Archibald last week. Who was there for that one? So that was great to get the perspective of an Indigenous education officer in a state school, a local school. We have a very different type of speaker today with a very different context and setting as well. Mr. Rowan Deanshaw is the principal of Kempsey Adventist School. And I think it would be fair to say that of current Seventh-day Adventist schools in Australia, it probably has the highest number of Aboriginal students or students identifying as Aboriginal. So it's quite a unique school context. Rowan's background is that he once was a student of Avondale College as well, so that should give you hope for your future. He has been a missionary teacher in Papua New Guinea. He has been a police officer. He's had a variety of different and interesting other jobs as well, and for the last, was it 10 or 15 years, has been back in Seventh-day Adventist School in the Heritage College, and most recently, for almost the last 10 years at Kempsey School. So before I say anything else that's wrong or incorrect, I'm going to hand over to him, and at the end of the time, there's time for questions. Is there time for questions during the presentation?
Yeah, for sure. How long have we got?
We normally finish and are out the door by 10 minutes too, so that leaves us with about 45 minutes at this point. Great.
Just to put my college experience here into some context, I made the comment to Brad as we were walking through the admin office. The last time I was in that building was for a discipline committee meeting back in the 80s. So I'm not. I'm a humble person, and I'm coming before you this afternoon just to share a story. So, very, very comfortable for you to interrupt, to ask questions, and to put anything forward that you might like to share yourselves. This is a presentation that myself and Leanne Lessick, the Deputy Principal in our secondary school, gave to an Aboriginal Learning Conference in Sydney at the University of Technology about 2 months ago. So it's basically the same presentation, and we made that presentation to a couple of hundred people who are involved in Aboriginal education throughout New South Wales and throughout the rest of Australia. A little bit of a stat before we start, just as an interesting aside, that New South Wales actually has about 60% of the people in Australia who identify as being Aboriginal. When we would typically think of the major centres for Aboriginal population being in, say, Western Australia, the Northern Territory, South Australia. Certainly, in percentage terms, they have quite a high number of Aboriginal people who identify as Aboriginal. But New South Wales actually has the greatest number of people in terms of sheer volume. That's really important to think about, because if you end up working in a school in New South Wales, at some point in your career, it's almost certain that you will have an Aboriginal student in your class. So the story that I want to share with you this afternoon is our story as a school, working with Aboriginal young people. We don't claim to be the experts. This is simply a story, but a lot of the lessons that I'm going to share with you this afternoon are born out of the School of Hard Knocks, of not getting it right and of thinking again about how we might do it differently. So I want to start just by giving some context. And Kempsey Adventist Schools is a PK to 12, 600 pupil school, mid-north coast of New South Wales. Some people see Kempsey, some people who understand government data, demographic data, see Kempsey as being a little bit similar to a little bubble of Central Australia that's somehow shifted over to the coast, because by any measure of social demography that you look at with Kempsey, it ranks in the bottom local government areas or postcodes in the state of New South Wales. So if we're talking about teenage suicide, teenage pregnancy, unemployment, mental health, levels of incarceration, domestic violence, the whole gamut of factors, they are overrepresented in the Kempsey context. Interestingly, just to add some texture to that, Kempsey was one of two places in Australia in the '67 referendum to vote as to whether or not Aboriginal people would be recognised as being citizens of the country. Kempsey was one of two places that voted no, and actually recorded the highest no vote in the country. That's really significant because the context of the Kempsey community in many respects has not changed a lot. You don't have to scratch very hard and you'll see some inherent racism in the community rising to the surface. It's an ugly fact, but it is actually the fact. That little picture on the bottom left-hand corner there, I know Shana would have driven past the old Kinchler Boys Home numerous times. But the Kinchler Boys Home, the facility still exists today, was a place where Aboriginal boys from the local community were taken from their families and raised apart from their families. Literally a stolen generation circumstance. Many of those boys are now middle-aged adults still living within the local community. And that's very much a very tangible link back to that not so distant, unfortunate past in the local area. Many of the grandparents who are connected with our school are stolen generation people. And why is this important in the context of education? Because that has a filter down effect. Because the stories that are told in homes, the cultural context, the influence, the mindset that young people develop and that they bring from home to school is very much impacted by that social history. I touched on the demographic data before, but that picture in the bottom left-hand corner is from a place called South Kempsey, which is literally within walking distance of Kempsey Adventist School. You don't drive down the main street of South Kempsey at night time. If you do, it's likely that your car will be hit by a rock. It's not an unusual thing to find a young Aboriginal person lying in the middle of the road. Unsuspecting motorists will stop their car and they will be robbed, or the car will be stolen and then left behind. A lot of issues with unemployment, with drugs. Kempsey is an interesting place as well, in that a lot of the poorer housing in the community is in chronically flood-prone areas, which leads to further dislocation and just a sense of disempowerment and a sense of hopelessness for many of the young people in the community. Now, CAS has existed. Next year is actually its 40th anniversary, and it stands as a little bit of a beacon in the local community. So in the context of the local community, there are numerous state primary schools. There's two large state high schools. There's a Catholic primary school and there's a Catholic secondary school. CAS is the only independent school in the local government area. When I came to Kempsey 9 years ago now, I can remember arriving from an eastern suburbs context in Melbourne and being struck almost immediately, almost like a slap in the face, that the place that education deserves as a potential change agent in the lives of these young people, it just wasn't there. It wasn't seen for what it potentially could be. That picture up on the top left there is a picture that was actually created towards the end of the 19th century. And they were trying to imagine what education might look like in the year 2000. And so you see that they probably weren't that far removed, but very much the sage on the stage, the teacher instructor delivering information to the students. What we know from experience when we work with Aboriginal young people is that they are experiential learners. They are not people who will like to sit and have a worksheet in front of them to answer questions from a textbook, or if I was standing talking to a group of Aboriginal young people now, they'd be switching off about this point because they would just be losing interest in someone just standing up the front, sharing information. Having said that, they very much learn through stories, but the stories need to be associated with practical, hands-on type activities. So we had an aim, and the aim was really the enactment of the Melbourne Declaration. The idea being that these young people were in a place of significant disadvantage, and what could we do as a school, or what could we achieve as a school if we simply ran the school as a good school? Simply thinking about creating a context where every young person, every Aboriginal young person, we've got 120 of them at CAS, every Aboriginal young person had an opportunity to succeed. One of our core functions would become removing barriers to them being successful at school, taking into account that journey that they were having away from school, and in many cases at school. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the work of Angela Duckworth. If you haven't had an exposure to Angela Duckworth, I couldn't recommend her work more highly. She's a renowned former school teacher, now a psychologist in the US. Her work in the space of growing grit in young people takes the work of Carol Dweck with the fixed and growth mindsets to another level, and really talks about how we grow grit in young people. So for us as a school, it was really about thinking, how do we create a level of grit? So Angela Duckworth's, are you familiar with Angela Duckworth's work at all? Her work, she's done a longitudinal study of a whole range of different people across all types of professions, students, trying to identify the key elements of success. And what it all boils down to is the capacity to grow and sustain a mindset of grit. So overcoming odds, no matter what is placed in front of a young person, having a mindset, having a will to push through those barriers. And for so many of our young people, and I'll go into it in a few months, so many of our young people, the mindset that's created is one of being defeated before they even arrive at school. They come to school assuming that they can't learn, it's all too hard, and if they're sitting in front of a teacher or in part of a learning environment where we're trying to teach them through very mainstream, typical Western modalities, they will slip through the gaps. We know that statistically because if you look at the averages nationally for success of Aboriginal young people in secondary schooling, the results and the achievement level of young Aboriginal people finishing secondary school and moving beyond that into successful career pathways, the actual percentage, in percentage terms, it's actually very low. And I'll talk in a couple of minutes about some of the things that we're doing in that space. So the first thing I want to talk about today is about relationship. So that gentleman sitting in the middle there with one of our school chaplains, Richard Campbell, is a renowned local Aboriginal artist, grew up in the Kinchela Boys' Home. He has scars on his wrists from when he was taken outside, tied to a tree and whipped as a boy for wetting his bed as a small child. He's a grandparent in our school. The Aboriginal ladies in the top left side there, the lady that's at the extreme right of the corner, another member of the stolen generation, but these are grandparents in our school. The impact that it has on the educational well-being of the young people, Aboriginal young people that we have in our school, by having those types of people coming in, working in our school, being part of our school community, is enormous, because it immediately creates a mindset for our young people that school is a safe place, because these people are prepared to come and be there. So investing the time, and it's not always a convenient time, but investing the time to build relationships with your key Aboriginal community stakeholders. Now that's never an easy thing. For example, in Kempsey, the dominant skin group in the Aboriginal community is the Dunghutti Nation, but there's also a separate subgroup within the community, and those two groups are like tribal warring factions at times. And so when we're trying to work through issues between Aboriginal community members and Aboriginal students, it's often the starting point for those healing processes is really getting the elders together and understanding what the core underlying issues are. But Richard Campbell spends time in our school on a regular basis. He's a key feature of our week-long NAIDOC week program. So at CAS, we don't have a NAIDOC day, we have a NAIDOC week, and that's basically many elements of the school's learning program are put aside for a week, and we do some very traditional Aboriginal focused activities. A lot of Aboriginal dancing, music. Richard's, as I say, is a famous painter. We've got a very large painting that he has actually hung in the Vatican, which is on permanent display in our school library. And story time with the elders, which is a regular part of our school program. Providing professional learning for our teachers, so that our Aboriginal elders are coming in at the beginning of the year and also in the middle of the year to spend time with the school staff, to help them understand cultural nuances that many Caucasian people will stumble over purely out of good-natured ignorance. You know, for example, for many Aboriginal people in Australia, the term Indigenous is highly offensive to them. It's highly offensive because, from a legal point of view, if you were born in Australia, legally you're classified as being Indigenous. Now, for many Aboriginal people, that is of no consequence to them. They're happy to be referred to as being Indigenous. But a much safer way of referring to an Aboriginal person is just that: an Aboriginal or a non-Aboriginal person, or an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person, rather than an Indigenous person. Little things like that send a really, really strong message to the members of your community, you understanding and being sensitive to the fact that they are sensitive to it. Family is very important, and in terms of relationship, Aboriginal culture is very much a matriarchal culture. The mother is the head of the home, and that's also a very, very important thing to understand. So as children are born, they will often take on the surname, their mother's maiden name as their surname, which creates a very complicated tree of names and connections within a school context. Challenging stereotypes. I can remember coming from Melbourne, which is, many of you will know, is quite probably the most multicultural, urban location in Australia. Kempsey is predominantly Caucasian and Aboriginal. There's a very small percentage of Asian people in the community, but predominantly Aboriginal and Caucasian. Unless you have got blinkers on, it's really, really confronting to step out of the car, walk into the shops, and be struck with the overt, in many cases, racism that exists within the community. And in terms of challenging stereotypes, our young people will leave school, and I'm trying to think of an example. Okay, here's an example, a very quick example. Standing in the supermarket about 3 weeks ago, stopped on the way to school to grab a couple of things that I'm going to need during the course of the day. And I'm in one of those aisles in the shopping centre, and they're being attended by the checkout person. And it's one of those wider aisles where people can come and go. And there's a lady standing beside me, and if you were to glance at her, she looks like she's going to work in a bank. She's got a business suit on. She's obviously has the appearance at first glance of being an educated white-collar worker. And while I'm standing there and she's standing there, don't know this person, a well-dressed Aboriginal person comes walking past where we were and went past us and went out. And this lady clicked her tongue and rolled her eyes at me. And in Kempsey, that's making a very overt notion about the fact that this person's Aboriginal and they think they can do what they like. One of the key elements of a successful school program in working with Aboriginal young people is being able to challenge those stereotypes, being able to create a context where the young person comes to school and feels safe, valued, welcome, regardless of what's happening away from school. Like Shana's in that picture. I think that's a little Shana in the blue shirt on the left. A big part of our senior school program is taking students to Fiji and Nepal, and for our Aboriginal young women, that's a fairly significant program, and it's very, very different to what the other schools in our community are doing. It's different because for many of the children, Aboriginal children particularly, who live in Kempsey, many of them have never literally left the Macleay Valley, which is where Kempsey's located. So we're talking about a life lived probably within a 50-kilometre radius. They've certainly never travelled on a plane. They've certainly never been to a community where a white person is in the minority. And our Aboriginal young people arrive in places like Fiji and Nepal, and the people love them. The people embrace them, the people draw them into their community, and you can see them, particularly the young girls, you can see them blossoming. And what we have found repeatedly is that the Aboriginal young women particularly will come back from these overseas service programs with a completely renewed focus on finishing school and getting onto a career pathway after they finish school. That ties in with the next part of the program. I understand that next week we've got Melanie Phelps, head of our Learning Enrichment Department, coming to talk to you. And she will talk to you specifically about different elements of the school program that are related to creating a level playing field for Aboriginal students, particularly in the way that learning is shaped, but creating a context where those young people can succeed. That photo on the bottom right side there is a group of Year 12 students from a couple of years ago who are at a formal function. But Kaz is currently graduating about 80% of our Aboriginal students into tertiary pathways. And I'll talk in a moment about how we're actually making that possible. I heard Brad before talking about the Sorry Day, and he was talking to me briefly about the Sorry Day and the way that functions perhaps in the local community here. What we know from experience in the Macleay at CAS is that the concept of sorry is meant for many young people, for Aboriginal young people and for many of their families. The sorry concept is like a social wound for them, and they carry a lot of shame. So trying to get a young person to come, like for example, I'm sure that if I called one of you down the front now and wanted to give you an award, you would gladly come down the front and accept the award and have a certain amount of pride in the fact that you were being acknowledged for something that you had done. For an Aboriginal young person, that's a very confronting scenario. Something that they would want to avoid. So if you're wanting to acknowledge an Aboriginal young person, whether it be in class, or whether it be in a formal school assembly or a chapel program or something of that ilk, it's something that you need to do a lot of work beforehand to make sure that they're comfortable, and in many instances it's not, and it's a case of acknowledging them very, very quietly on the side. I'll just go back to this area of well-being, because I just want to focus in on it in a moment. I just want to leave an impression with you before we watch this film. I'll take some questions. A key thing to think about in terms of Aboriginal students and their well-being. Many of the, if you can assume, you're not all going to come and work at Kempsey, maybe none of you will ever work at a school like Kempsey, but you can almost be certain that if you're working in a school and you're working with Aboriginal young people, that somewhere in their family, in their past, and certainly will have an influence and an impact on them, there's an absence of well-being in their social history. And when we talk about educating Aboriginal students, all about well-being, I just want to share a couple of things that we're doing at CAS at the moment in that space, because it's really gets to the heart of achieving success with education with Aboriginal young people. And the time that you have with Mel Phelps next week, where she talks specifically about enacting that into a learning program, will really be part B of what I'm talking about today. CAS is the only Adventist school in Australia that has a wellbeing department. And when I talk about a wellbeing department, I'm not talking about we've got a counsellor and the kids go and see the counsellor. We have a child psychologist, we have a counsellor, we have an assistant principal who works full time in that area looking after the program. We've got an Aboriginal student wellbeing worker, and we've got a Caucasian student wellbeing worker. Put that into context, if you go to Avondale School across the way here and you were to have access to their data in the school in regards to in relation to student wellbeing, you would find that typically they might have one, perhaps two reports of students at risk of significant harm in the course of a year. So a child who's required or mandated by law to be reported to Family and Community Services. At CAS we average around 3 a week, and those things vary as broadly as Aboriginal parent prostituting her daughters to support a drug habit, children being sodomised at home, children whose parents have been incarcerated, who are breaking into a house in the evening so they've got somewhere to sleep. They're coming to school, the wellbeing department are supporting them by washing their uniform, giving them a bed to sleep in at school during the day, making sure that they're fed, looked after, all of those sorts of elements. So I would encourage you, as you begin moving towards working full-time as educators, if you are in a place of caring for, obviously for any young person, but particularly for an Aboriginal young person, think about what you're not seeing when they present at school. Think about perhaps the type of social dislocation that they're experiencing away from school. Having said that, many of our young people, Aboriginal young people, come from very supportive homes, but many of them don't. And statistically, they are at higher risk in many instances than non-Aboriginal students. One of the things that CAS is very, very committed to, specifically in relation to learning, with that thought that Aboriginal young people are very much experiential learners. We had an experience, or we had an opportunity arise for us about a month and a half ago, where we were contacted by the Association of Independent Schools here in New South Wales to say, look, we love what you're doing with Aboriginal young people. Can you please come up with a project and we'll give you some money to support you to enact a program specifically for our Aboriginal children. There was a group of us who spent some time at Harvard University last year, and we completed a course around reimagining learning for the 21st century. But one of the things that we had an exposure to while we were completing that course was to spend some time with some educators from both Canada and from California, who are doing some very innovative left field things with Native American young people, who, like many Aboriginal young people in Australia, slip through the gaps. So what we came up with the support of Harvard University, was a program or a draft initiative to implement a project-based learning, whole-of-school project-based learning program at CAS. Do you have an understanding, when I talk about project-based learning, do you have an understanding of what I'm talking about? Yes? No? No? Project-based learning, very much, let's imagine in New South Wales that you're a history teacher or you're a maths teacher. You'll have a syllabus and you will sit down, plan out units of work, you'll plan out an assessment schedule, you'll maybe conduct some assessments throughout the course of the unit, you'll work towards an exam at the end of the, or a test or something, and you'll grade the students and you'll report on it. That's most typically what would occur in most schools. Project-based learning is a completely different approach to learning. It's taking the skills that you, or the outcomes that you're wanting to achieve and putting them into a project. So I'm not talking about a project where you're holding up and doing a PowerPoint at the end of the day. I'm talking about a real life project where you might be developing a positive, sustainable ecology outcome which ties geography and biology into one project. Harvard are working with us at the moment. We had a Skype session with them yesterday, just on the process of refining it. The exciting thing is that the New South Wales government have given us $450,000 over 2 years to implement that project-based learning. But the whole reason why we've been given that funding is to create an experiential learning opportunity for our Aboriginal young people. All of the students in our school will benefit from it, but the Aboriginal young people are truly the focus of that exciting initiative. I'd like to show you a little film, and I'm happy to take some questions at the end.
In the past, dancing in the rain, 2 feet in the sand, we're still finding Peter Pan to make things stay the same.
I come from Multicultural Lake. I like to go to the beach sometimes, or just go down to the football field and kick the football around. My favourite football team is the Broncos because they just do a good job in the past few years. My favourite player is Sam Thaiday because he's a captain and he makes good choices for his players, and he makes a good lead in the Broncos. I'm proud to be an Aboriginal because we have a lot of culture and a lot of stories about the Aboriginals in the Dreamtime. And we have good art and dot painting, and yeah.
I'm from Kempsey, born in Kempsey, living in Kempsey, and yeah, for a long time. Well, I play footy on Saturdays, and Sundays I play AFL.
What's your favourite subject at school?
PDHP. Well, we're from down Griffith Way, and that's all Wadgery, and Dungutty here in Kempsey. It's 2 tribes. I'm proud to be Aboriginal because, I don't know, Not really, I'm just proud. Yep. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's pretty hard, I guess, because I don't know my language, and it's kind of disappointing when I go around to other places like Brisbane or Perth, and they all still know their culture just because of colonisation and stuff like that. I guess because New South Wales was hit so hard, I don't know my language yet, pretty much like that, and I guess I struggle with that. And that's why we kind of do NAIDOC here to kind of revive our Dungbo culture, because it's so, there's hardly anything there left. So I guess that's why it's so important to do NAIDOC here as well. For all of my younger cousins, they don't know much, that's why, yeah.
I have 16 brothers and sisters. Yeah, it's complicated. There's 6 boys and 10 girls. I'm not a full Aboriginal. I'm half Fijian. But yeah,
Yeah, NAIDOC's a special week. I think for all the Indigenous people of this country, because you know, people at the start of the year, they have Australia Day, you know, and then we have NAIDOC week to acknowledge our day, or our week, you may as well say. And yeah, it's good because it brings the other side of you know, the community together, and brings everybody together to do something that's you know, fun, like painting or sports or anything that's got Indigenous meaning, you know.
And what I like about Aboriginal culture and NAIDOC is that those kids have got that special week where they can come together and say, this is our week, this is us, this is where we come from, and they're showing their culture to other kids in the school and other people, and gives them a sense of pride within themselves and a bit of their identity. You know, they can identify that they're Aboriginal kids and that they come from an Aboriginal culture.
I just like being Aboriginal. You find out cool stuff with it, like your background. Yeah, I can't really explain it.
You think your dad's pretty cool?
Yeah,
Why is he cool?
because he looks after us and he looks out for us.
Have you ever been scared before?
Yes,
Tell me about that.
when I almost got trampled on by a horse. I got chased by a horse. I have 2 little brothers, and I care about them, and I look out for them. And one's named Al and one's named Noah.
I think it's important that that every Indigenous kid acknowledges their Aboriginality, and you know, and be you know, proud of it, pretty much. And because at the end of the day, it is who you are. You are who you are. Doesn't matter, you know, what anybody else perceives of you. You are what you are, and you know, it's good to celebrate that in the Indigenous week, you know. You can get judged, or you can get rid of in a lot of things. Every Aboriginal person experiences it, and anybody that's not Indigenous doesn't, simply.
Like, you get some people, like, you just feel a vibe off them, like, just because you're Aboriginal, like, they do bad things, like they steal or it doesn't mean that every Aboriginal is like that. It's just the way that they've been raised and the way that it's just the way, that they've grown up and they don't know any better. So, yeah, I think lots of us get judged by what other people do. They think that just because another group does it, that all of us do it. Like bad things like stealing and, like drinking and drugs. Yeah.
I try to be the best that I can. I didn't have a mum in my life, so for me, the struggles that I go through, being a young mum, I have nothing to reflect on. So for me, I do the best with my kids with what I know. And a part of that is trying to explain to your kids the difference between being Indigenous.
If you are interested in watching the rest of that film, that goes for about 18 minutes. That's the Vimeo link for it. So I guess if I can leave you with one thought. Aboriginal communities are communities of storytelling. They're communities that are embedded in deep in relationships. That old saying of people are not interested in what you know until they know how much you care is never true when it comes to working with Aboriginal young people as educators. If you want to educate an Aboriginal young person, you need to be prepared to become part of their community life. I want to emphasise again that whilst we face lots of challenges in Kempsey in terms of working with Aboriginal young people, it would be remiss of me to say that we don't face very similar challenges working with Caucasian young people. We work with many Caucasian families that are second and third generation welfare dependent, and many of the social issues that I've talked about this afternoon are just as evident or more evident in their lives. What they don't typically experience is generational racism and generational disadvantage. And for many of the Aboriginal young people, regardless of where they're coming from in Australia, you only have to think back to their grandparents, and you won't have to look very far to find somebody who's lived a very difficult and challenging context. I'm very happy to answer any questions or assist here if anybody has questions. Shana, you look like you've got a question. Let me just say, Shana is sitting there quietly. Shana is one of our past school captains, so Shana could probably have come and delivered this talk this afternoon, and because she's been to Fiji, been to Nepal, walked a journey with some great Aboriginal young people in our school, and her mum is actually the assistant principal who runs our student wellbeing department. So there's some good perspectives that I'm sure Shana could share.
Is there a lot of ongoing professional development for staff that's needed to address these issues, or?
It's very hard to give people what they haven't got, and some people themselves will bring their own baggage to a school in terms of they may have really ingrained perspectives on Aboriginal people, and we certainly had to cross some hurdles with staff in terms of getting them to begin to see the Aboriginal young people they're working with in a different way. But certainly the professional learning is a little bit like child protection. It's not something that you do once and forget about. It's something that you keep going back and revisiting. And the interesting thing is, I would liken it a little bit to like peeling layers off an onion. You know, we've got a beautiful Aboriginal student wellbeing worker in our school, Leo Wright, who's in his late 60s. And I heard one of the little children, not Aboriginal children, one of the little children in, I think it was kindy or year 1 this year, asked the teacher whether he was God. Because he just sort of walks about the school, has got this bit of white beard, and he's just got this presence and aura about him, but he's the sort of person where you think you know him, you think you understand, has he got anything else to share? And then he'll give you another little nugget of Aboriginal culture that gives you a completely different perspective on how you might work with a group of people or think about approaching a particular challenge or situation. But look, we've had some great success with Aboriginal young people who've come into the school through working with communities. We had a boy at our school who came to us from one of the local state high schools. He'd been expelled from the school. After taking to the teachers' cars with bricks, he'd smashed windows, hit them with sticks, because he was being taunted racially in the schoolyard, and the level of frustration built up to the point where he just exploded. And he came to us, would we be prepared to give him another opportunity at school? So we sat down and started working with his carer, because he was in, I think he was about 15 when he joined us, and I think he was in his 18th foster home. He was just getting passed around, had been abused as a small child. And somehow or other, after spending a brief period of time with us, he got moved out west to another foster home, into a context where he wasn't happy, and he ran away. And about 2 weeks later, he appeared back at school, all dishevelled, but he just wanted to be at school. And so we worked with a local government agency to place him in a different home and keep him with us. And he's really blossomed as a young person. And as an Adventist school, as a Christian school, it's an amazing experience to see these young people who've come from completely broken situations, who could never look someone in the eye. All you'll see of them in an enrolment interview is the top of their head. And after a term or two of being in a context where there's people who are literally loving them unconditionally, we've got a special policy in our school, a literal policy, that's probably different to most other schools because we have a long history of taking young people into staff homes and placing them in staff homes. That Aboriginal girl with her 16 siblings, she has lived with staff for some period of time. We've got a boy, the longest we've had is an Aboriginal boy who lived with a staff member for 2.5 years. But those contexts create a scenario, and this is all by consent with families, but it creates a scenario where these young people can thrive. And to see that young person a term or two into their school experience, to stand up in front of a chapel, in front of several hundred of their peers, and give a testimony about how Christ has changed their life. Shane has seen some of it. It's a pretty special experience, but it indicates that something's working. That was a very long answer, wasn't it?
Ron, quick question. You mentioned 80% of your students on a pathway to tertiary studies. So it's an amazing stat. What's going on there?
Yeah, look, one of the things that we have done, and this has only been a relatively recent thing, but we've started to formalise it because we realise that we need to put a little bit more shape to it. We've actually created a CAS Aboriginal student alumni, because what we know statistically for students who are coming from low SES communities who go into tertiary study, whether they're Aboriginal or Caucasian, they will last less than a semester, because the dislocation coming from where they've been, and typically if they've got through their HSC into a tertiary scenario, they've done it with quite a bit of support. Now, I'm not talking about support to hold their pen, I'm talking about support to make sure they're getting fed, they've got somewhere safe to sleep, they've got someone watching their back, they feel comfortable. And that, when they step out of that into the big scary world, where there's not that same level of support, they fall over very quickly. So what we've done and worked with a long list of Aboriginal young people over a period of time is to maintain that connection after they leave school. So school continues to be that academic and social reference and support point for them. So the school's job doesn't finish the day they step onto the stage and shake my hand. The school's job finishes when they achieve employment after they finish their tertiary study. So we maintain that relationship. So getting them in is one thing, getting them out the other end is the key part. Getting them in is relatively straightforward. It's getting them out the other end and into employment.
Might be time for one last question.
I do have one. I was wondering if the Aboriginal students that go to Kempsey Adventist, if they're treated any differently in the community by other Aboriginals.
Because they're going to an
because
Adventist school
they're
or
going
going
to
to a Christian school.
Yeah.
I don't think so. Well, all we know in the community is that, you can jump on YouTube and watch fights from kids at Kempsey High and Melbourne High and Kempsey and the like. We don't have that sort of culture at our school, so the kids who come to us will typically take on a different sort of mindset, different sort of culture, and they do get pulled and pushed in the community a little bit in terms of why they won't do this and why they won't do that. But Shane is probably better place to answer that question. Shane, what was it like for your peers? Do you remember that?
My class personally, I never had any sort of negative feedback where they're getting picked up from other schools. It was more like that they're thankful to be in a school where they are it's not racist against anyone, everyone's equal, they feel like they're a part of the community. So it's more like they're thankful to be there rather than scared of being picked on by the rest of the community.
Yeah, and that leads to a high level of trust. So I have Aboriginal elders and parents come in with tears in their eyes thanking us for creating a safe place for their kids. Yeah.
Oh, thanks everyone for coming, but particularly thanks to Rowan for coming all the way down from Kempsey School. You're in the area for the next couple of days, aren't you, for more meetings? But he's kindly volunteered the detour to us specifically to be with you guys. So another very interesting presentation. Could you please put your hands together for looks like Shana's going to be a guest lecturer sometime next week. We'll ask her to do a short talk for us. So, sneaking away quietly in the back of the room there for too long, we'll work out a way of getting some feedback.
She was always very good talking when she was at school. So.
It's going to be quiet. Good luck with your essay writing. As always, these lectures will be uploaded to Moodle, or a link will be uploaded. So, yes, thank you very much, and see you all later. Oh, and of course, you're welcome to do a prac at some stage at Kempsey School. So, if you want to do a prac, have a talk to Rowan maybe, or to the Education Department.
I'm just asking in regards to the